It's under the church website. So maybe, I don't know if it's exactly YouTube channel but if you go to tricounty.church, under media, you can find last week's lesson if you want.
Every time. On YouTube, it's Tri-County TV.
Oh, okay. That's how you do it.
I wasn't able to navigate the YouTube. I always have to go through the website.
Yeah, I was able to get there through YouTube.
If you do Tri-County TV, that's what.
Probably better than me.
Tri-County TV.
Yes.
Tri-County TV. And I still had to page down to find it.
Probably because it doesn't have many views.
So, if you do a YouTube search, Tri-County TV.
Is it .tv?
No.
Okay, all right.
Well, maybe space, probably. Either way,
I just had to.
we'll figure it out.
Have any more sweets?
Oh, God, no. I'll take from my wife. Blame her.
Okay, so we're finally done with 1 through 12, which is the first major section. So we're going to start the next major section, but let's zoom out, and talk about the whole book for a minute. The first blank at the very top is Isaiah is about the. Anybody want to guess?
Judgment?
No, there's a lot of judgment in there, but there's a bigger.
Suffering of Christ or the coming of Christ?
The suffering of Christ, the coming of Christ, those are all subcategories of this. Just really the Messiah, which is the Hebrew word for Christ.
Is there another set of these?
Oh yeah, sorry. I thought I said enough out.
Thanks,
So, Isaiah is about the Messiah. That's the big idea. And the book is built around 3 messianic portraits. Obviously not portraits made with drawings, but with words. But I made drawings to help you keep them straight. So the first section shows the Messiah as the king, chapters 1 to 39. And the second section shows the Messiah as the servant, 40 to 55. And the last section shows the Messiah as the anointed conqueror. Now, anointed is the same word, Messiah. That's what it means. But because David was anointed, it came to have all kinds of Davidic, what do you call that when a word takes on overtone, connotations, yeah. So the word grew in its meaning as more scripture was revealed. But at Isaiah's point, these are the 3 different portraits he paints of the Messiah. And so we're in part 1, which is the king who reigns in, anybody want to guess?
Babylon?
In what?
Babylon?
Well, this is about the Messiah as king.
Oh.
There is a king who reigns in Babylon, and he's going to be a big part of this, but
It's a short print.
well, yeah, there is a heavenly one of these, but it's Zion, is what I was thinking. There is an earthly Zion and a heavenly Zion, and they're going to merge at some point in the future, but okay, so now this is the part we're in, and this part about the king who reigns in Zion, how many chapters does it cover? Yeah, so it's the biggest of the sections, of the 3 sections. So the painting the portrait of the Messiah as the king is a big concept. It's a big theme, and as Mattier says, it's a complex theme. So, Kate, could you go ahead and read this quote from Mattier and then allow them to pause so they can fill in the blanks? This is a quote about the theme of him as king.
It is a complex theme full of tensions.
Now, tension is like two things that are apparently contradictory, right? Just like you should be generous, but you should also be wise with your money. Okay, so there's like well, which should you be? Well, both. It's in tension. And how much do you go to one way? That's something you have to work through. That's a tension.
Sometimes the king is the Lord himself, sometimes he's the current king of the house of David, and sometimes he is the king who is yet to come.
So think about chapter 6, Isaiah saw Yahweh as the king on the throne. In chapter 7, the house of David was Ahaz. Remember, he says, now listen, you house of David. He calls Ahaz the house of David. And then in chapter 9, the king is yet to come. Now, obviously, Yahweh is king now. Isaiah saw him on the throne currently. But there's another sense in which the king is yet to come. So there's all these tensions.
Overall, the primary topic is the future king. Yet, even that topic holds tension between two future kings, the Lord's coming reign and a king born of David's line.
Let me pull out a paper Bible. So the two future kings that are in tension, the first one is Yahweh himself. Listen to 24:23. The moon will be confounded, the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts reigns on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders. Okay, so the Lord is going to reign on the throne in Mount Zion, but also there's going to be a king born of David's line. We covered this extensively last week in chapter 11, but there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and then down in verse 10, in that day the root of Jesse shall stand as a signal for the people. Of him all the nations shall inquire. It describes his reign there. So, it's a pretty complex theme, a lot of tensions, but all this stuff is important. So now we're going to review and I made a little chart of the sections. However, the boxes are a little bit small, so I made an enlarged version on the next page. So there's a little more room to write. I thought that would be helpful.
So that's identical to this?
Well, it's identical to this except for the fact that it only goes up through chapter 27 as opposed to all the way to 39. Because we're only doing 13 to 23 today. No, we're only doing up to 23 today. So the section, if you look at what you have, the section, it says judgment and hope for the nations. But on the front chart, judgment and hope for the nations is divided by a dotted line. There's the judgment part and the hope part. We're only going up through the judgment today. So 13 to 23 is the judgment, and then 24 to 27 is the hope. And we're not covering that. We'll cover that next week. But don't worry about that. Let's review what we've covered. So 1 through 5, Jerusalem is evil. as we talked in length about all the bad things they were doing. But someday it will be, what do you think it will be someday? Anybody want to take a guess? If not, that's okay.
Are you talking about when he comes back and reigns?
Well, it's not always clear. The when is not always clear in Isaiah, but listen to this. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 21. How the faithful city has become a whore. She who was full of justice, righteousness lodged in her, but now murderers. It goes on through their injustice, through verse 23. They don't take care of the orphans and widows. And so he's going to be punished. Verse 26, and I will restore your judges as at the beginning, or the first, and your counselors as at the beginning. Afterward, you shall be called the city of righteousness, the faithful city.
So it will be
It will be righteous.
righteous.
In Isaiah's day, it was wicked, but it's going to be righteous. Now, notice that what it says in 26, at the beginning, I'll restore your judges and your counselors as at the beginning. What was the beginning of Jerusalem? When did that become the capital city? This is the major theme. This is just the little hint of an introduction. Isaiah always does this. It's going to be a huge theme, but he just hints at it. And then later it develops bigger and bigger and bigger. When did Jerusalem become the capital city? Who conquered Jerusalem from the Canaanites?
The Assyrians? No, the Romans.
Well, way before that.
Oh,
David did.
okay.
David conquered Jerusalem. It was supposed to have been conquered under Joshua in that day, but it wasn't. It was a Canaanite city all the way up through King David, and he conquered it and moved his capital there, and it became
Called the city of David.
right. And there's a whole lot of political reasons why he did that. He had just taken the kingship away from the house of Saul and the tribe of Benjamin, moved it to the tribe of Judah, and so he chose a city that had no former ties to any tribe, and technically it was in the territory that should have been Benjamin's. So he was making some concessions to the tribe of Benjamin to try to prevent a civil war. There was some civil war when he first took over between one of Saul's sons and him, Ishbosheth. But anyway, so there's a whole lot of reasons why he chose that city, but he conquered it, and it became the capital city. So that was the beginning of Jerusalem. So a little hint of David there. All right. This idea about Jerusalem in chapters 1 through 5, how wicked it is and how it's someday going to be righteous, doesn't immediately seem to fit under the king section of 1 through 39, but it's just beginning in that seed form here. And it's going to grow, especially when you think about how capital cities, we talked about this in a previous lesson, how important a capital city was back then. In America, we feel like, Washington, D.C. is our capital, but it used to be Philadelphia. It was Lancaster for a day. That's where I grew up. The capital city, where it is, isn't super important to us. But it used to be. In fact, the British thought when they got Philadelphia, okay, we win, we got the capital, but we just moved our capital. And so it's a new mindset today. But back then, that was super important. So talking about Jerusalem is, it's almost the way we think of throne as symbolic of kingship. They would have thought of the royal city as equally symbolic of kingship. Okay, so that's 1 through 5. That's the first little box above the dotted line there. And then chapter 6. Chapter 6 is a key chapter, and all the major themes of the book are there in chapter 6. And they all fall under kingship. You've got the king's power displayed. You've got the king's holiness. Now, we don't think of holiness as being a royal attribute because we're so focused on the corruption that power brings to human beings, which it does. But ideally, the ideal situation, the way God intended rule to be, was a rule of holiness and justice. So that's there in God on his throne in his holiness. And the judgment, the king is the one who gives out judgment, obviously. He doles out punishments. And the purification. It's easier for us to see that as a kingly trait if we think of the sense of pardon. The president can give a pardon. In this case, there's some punishment involved. The purification by fire is just pictured there, just hinted at there in with that little coal on his mouth that the cherub brings to him. But that's going to get fleshed out big time throughout the course of the book. Also, hope is another theme introduced there in chapter 6. That's a key theme for the whole book. You can see the section 1 through 12 is in the black there with the white writing is judgment and hope for Jerusalem. And then the next major section, judgment and hope for the nations. So hope is a key theme introduced in 6. And lastly, glory. I wasn't sure the order where to put glory, but the whole vision is glorious. And then the final section of 1 through 12 is 7 through 12. And we've got an A, B, and C. A, if you remember, the failure or decline of David's house. Pictured in a lot of ways, pictured with King Uzziah laying there, unclean, on his deathbed, outside of the palace because of his leprosy. Pictured in Ahaz's failure to trust. He'd rather trust TP3, Tiglath, than God. So the line of David is falling fast. It's just a shadow of what it used to be. And they're trusting in pagans, so pagans destroy them. He chooses to trust Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser III, and that is who comes and captures God's people and destroys 99.9% of Judah. And just the only thing he doesn't get is inside the city walls. And it comes pretty close. Okay, so that's A. B is there's a merger between the divine king that we saw in chapter 6 and this crumbling Davidic line. And so you see in chapter 9 and chapter 11, you see there's going to be a shoot that's going to come out of this line, but it's merging with the divine king. It says stuff like, He will be called Mighty God, Everlasting Father. Yeah, all these things, of the increase of his government, there will be no end, something like that.
About a delivery.
Yeah, can you go take it? I don't know what that's about. But, yeah, so there's all these references to divine and about, in chapter 11, with we talked about last week, with his kingdom going, well, we'll talk about that next for C. So there's all these, the merger of the divine king and the human king, which obviously, at the time Isaiah wrote that, was a great tension. Well, is it going to be a divine king or is it going to be a human king? Of course, now with the New Testament, that tension is resolved. And then C, this new divine / human king, his greatness or his awesomeness, and that's in who he is, his person, in his reign, and this is all fleshed out in chapter 11. And lastly, domination, worldwide domination. Again, in a modern Western setting, that doesn't seem like a great righteous king. Worldwide domination is almost synonymous with evil in our modern culture, but in this case, it's not.
Only if you are
Only if you are evil, yes. I guess.
a perfectly righteous person wanted to take over the world. I'd be all right with that.
A perfectly righteous person wanted to take over the world, yeah. But only if they had a right to the world. Right? If they owned the world, because, they'd made it or something, then it would be okay. Worldwide domination. And now that obviously, talking about worldwide domination, obviously raises the question, well, what's God's plan for all the other nations? Beyond, we've been focusing on God's people here, mainly Jerusalem, but also Judah, and a little bit of Israel. But what's God's plan for the rest of the nations? So that's the next section, the next major section of part 1, is the judgment and hope for the nations. Okay, so we're going to watch a little video. Now, I will say he talks really fast, so if you want me to play it again, I'll play it again. Where is there it is. You don't feel like you need to take notes. Just try to take it in. There's a lot of information here. Here we go.
Can you see? Can you see?
The book of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem in the latter half of Israel's kingdom period, and he spoke on God's behalf to the leaders of Jerusalem and Judah. He spoke, first of all, a message of God's judgment. He warned Israel's corrupt leaders that their rebellion against their covenant with God would come at a cost, that God was going to use the great empires of Assyria and after them Babylon to judge Jerusalem if they persisted in idolatry and oppression of the poor. But that announcement was combined with a message of hope. Isaiah believed deeply that God would one day fulfill all of his covenant promises, that he would send a king from David's line to establish God's kingdom, remember 2 Samuel 7, that he would lead Israel in obedience to all of the laws of the covenant made at Mount Sinai, remember Exodus chapter 19. And all of this was so that God's blessing and salvation would flow outward to all of the nations, like God promised to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And it's this hope that compelled Isaiah to speak out against the corruption and idolatry of Israel in his day. Now, the book has a pretty complex literary design, but there's one simple way to see how it all fits together. Chapters 1 through 39 contain 3 large sections that develop Isaiah's warning of judgment on Israel. And it all culminates in an event pointed to at the end of chapter 39, the fall of Jerusalem and the exile of the people to Babylon. But in chapters 1 to 39, there's also a message of hope that after the exile, God's covenant promises would all be fulfilled. And chapters 40 to 66 pick up that promise of hope and develops it further. In this video, we're just going to focus on chapters 1 to 39. The first main section focuses on Isaiah's vision of judgment and hope for Jerusalem. And it begins as Isaiah accuses the city's leaders of covenant rebellion, idolatry, injustice. And God says he's going to judge the city by sending the nations to conquer Israel. Isaiah says that this will be like a purifying fire that burns away all that's worthless in Israel in order to create a new Jerusalem that's populated by a remnant that has repented and turned back to God. And Isaiah says that that's when God's kingdom will come and all nations will come to the temple in Jerusalem and learn of God's justice, bringing about an age of universal peace and harmony. Now, it's this basic storyline of the old Jerusalem purifying judgment into the new Jerusalem. This is going to get repeated over and over throughout the book, getting filled in with increasing detail. So, at the center of this section is Isaiah's grand vision of God sitting on his throne in the temple. And he's surrounded by these heavenly creatures that are shouting that God is holy, holy, holy. And Isaiah suddenly realizes just how corrupt he and his people Israel are. And he's certain that he's going to be destroyed by God's holiness, but he's not. God's holiness, in the form of this burning coal, comes and burns him, but not to destroy. Rather, it purifies him from his sin. And as Isaiah ponders this strange experience, God commissions him with a very difficult task. He is to keep announcing this coming judgment, but because Israel has reached a point of no return, his warnings are going to have a paradoxical effect of hardening the people. But Isaiah is to trust God's plan. Israel is going to be chopped down like a tree and left like a stump in a field. And that stump will itself be scorched and burned. But after all of that burning, God says that this smoldering stump is a holy seed that will survive into the future. It's a small sign of hope, but who or what is that holy seed? The rest of this section offers an answer. Isaiah confronts Ahaz, a descendant of David and a king of Jerusalem, and he announces his downfall. God says that it's the great empire of Assyria who will first chop Israel down and devastate the land, but there's hope. Because of God's promise to David, he's going to send after this destruction a new king named Emmanuel, which means God with us. And Emmanuel's kingdom is going to set God's people free from violent, oppressive empires. And Isaiah describes this coming king as a small shoot of new growth that will emerge from the old stump of David's family. It's this king that's the holy seed from chapter 6. And the king is going to be empowered by God's Spirit to rule over a new Jerusalem and bring justice for the poor, and all nations will look to this messianic king for guidance. His kingdom will transform all creation, bringing peace. Now, you finish chapters 1 through 12 with a pretty good understanding of Isaiah's message of judgment and hope. But when will this all happen? Isaiah saw another empire arising after Assyria, and that's Babylon, who would also attack Jerusalem and actually succeed in destroying it. And that brings us into the next sections of the book. So first, we have a large collection of poems that explore God's judgment and hope for the nations. We learn, first of all, of the fall of Babylon and Israel's neighbors. Isaiah could see that Assyria's world power would one day be replaced by the empire of Babylon, a nation even more destructive and arrogant. Babylon's kings claimed that they were higher than all other gods, and so God vows to bring Babylon down. And not only Babylon. Isaiah goes on to list Israel's neighbors, accusing them all of the same kind of pride and injustice, and he predicts their ultimate ruin. But remember, for Isaiah, God's judgment is never the final word for Israel or the nations. And that leads into the next section, with a series of poems that tell a tale of two cities.
Okay, so that's going to be the hope section that we're not going to cover today. So you can see the section we're covering today, 13 to 23, is all about Babylon and the other nations around the people of God. Okay, questions about the video?
Terrific video.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah, there's one of these on every book of the Bible, and lots of other things too.
It's called the Bible Project.
Yeah, their idea was to make an overview video of every book.
Couldn't find my cursor. There was one chart there I thought was really good. That
Well-
put it in perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I can print out for you whatever you want.
He's got a giant coffee table book of every graphic that they've made.
Now remember, Isaiah, I've said before, Isaiah is arguably the most difficult book in the Bible, so the video is harder to understand in this one than any other. And I used all their resources you can download for free. So I used their outline here with the
Graphics are good too.
yeah, with a few tweaks of my own, mainly from my ear. But so let's explore the section then. Starting in chapter 13, there's going to be a lot of neighboring nations. Who can tell me in 13 through 23 what the first country that is going to get judgment, that God's declaring judgment on?
Country or empire?
Country, empire, people group, something along. Babylon, that's right. Okay. And then who's next on the Hit list.
Assyria?
Well, Assyria, that's actually part of the Babylon section because,
Oh, okay, that's,
let me explain why though, because that's very important. In Isaiah's day, Assyria is the world power. And so he's predicting that another empire is going to come called Babylon. And then he's declaring judgment on them. They exist in his day, but they're not an important people group. And then take a look at, I don't have it on here, but take a look at the end of 14. He says, so Assyria's going to be destroyed. That's what's going to bring Babylon into power. Well, let me just, yeah, that's coming up. But let me just talk about what's happening to Babylon here. He says, who's going to come to power after Babylon? I will bring against you a, I don't have the verse here. It's the Medes, but he names them. And they're
starting 17,
verse 17.
Well, verse 19, it says it'll be like Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah. He names the Medes by name, which were not well-known people at all. They're very far away.
Yeah, I have it in verse 17.
Verse 7, can you read it?
It says, behold, I am going to stir up the Medes against them, will not bear the silver, or take pleasure in gold.
Is that in chapter
13?
oh, 13?
13, 17. Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so then the next empire is going to be, now we call this the Medes and the Persians, Media, Persia. But there's these world empires, and the whole concept here is that, think about Ahaz looking at Assyria. So powerful. He couldn't imagine a more powerful king, but within a generation, they're gone, and Babylon takes over. Well, maybe a couple generations, but a very short amount of time. And they're so even more powerful. They actually conquer Jerusalem. But within a couple generations, they're gone. And God is raising up peoples and giving them power to do His purposes. So this idea of this overturn in earthly political power, what we might call geopolitical power, because they're conquering, is really all in God's hands. Okay, so the next one, what did you say, Lynn? The next...
Philistia.
Yeah, Philistia. Who's next? Moab. We've got, in this section, we've got 10 different prophecies towards people groups. Who's next after Moab?
Syria?
Okay, Damascus, yeah, but where is the start in Damascus? Look what it says. This is chapter 17, verse 1. An oracle concerning Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease to be a city. So that's the head of Syria, not to be confused with Assyria. The cities of Aroer are destroyed. They will be for flocks, which will lie down, and none will make them afraid. The fortress will disappear from Ephraim. What's talking about? What's Ephraim again? What's that a name for? Anybody remember? It's Israel, the northern kingdom of the Jews, Israel. So why is it putting Damascus, or Aram, together in one basket One hand basket. They're both going to the same place in that hand basket. Why is it putting them together in the same pot with Damascus? Anybody remember anything from chapter 7? What?
They threatened.
They joined together. And so the northern kingdom decided to trust in this little neighboring kingdom of Syria. And they joined together. They actually attacked Judah together. So little hint there that when you cast your lot in with somebody, you might rise together or you might fall together. So this is both Syria and Israel. Okay, next group. Okay, yeah. Do you know where that is on a map? Yeah. So it's sort of considered as a part and parcel with the next one starting in 19. Yeah. There's Upper Egypt in the Delta, Lower Egypt in the Delta, Upper Egypt, Nubia, and Cush, or Ethiopia, all along the Nile. And sometimes all those Nile kingdoms were together. At some point, Cushite kings were the pharaohs. There were certain Cushite dynasties over all of Egypt. At some point, they had a pharaoh of the north and the south, and separate kings. So anyway, my point is, it's all one big ball of wax there. So I'm just going to call it Egypt. Okay, there's our first list of 5. And then there's going to be another list of 5 in this section. And
Egypt is all those along the Nile?
yeah. So if we have here coast of the Mediterranean, and this is a little bit, but you've got up here, you've got Lower Egypt, which is the Delta. So Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, then I think next is Nubia, and lastly is Cush. So all this. And then of course you've got the Red Sea here. You've got the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, the Euphrates and the Tigris out to the Persian Gulf here. All right, let's look at the next list. The tone shifts. We don't have time. We're just flying through all these chapters here because we need to finish this book by Thanksgiving. So, but the tone here shifts. There's kind of a general sense of God's in control and God's saying this is going to happen, and Isaiah's kind of pumped about it. And then in this, it gets dark, and even Isaiah is kind of freaked out by the stuff he's prophesying. Hope I can find that. Let's see. Chapter 21. So this is a prophecy. It says, the oracle, and this is the ESV, the oracle concerning the wilderness of the sea. He doesn't say who it's to. Now, does anyone, their Bible editors, tell you who it's to above that? Chapter 21. You have a heading. In the beginning of 21, what did yours have, Lynn?
Mine, you want the first book it has here, 21, 1 to 10?
Yeah.
Babylon, who led forces against Assyrian power, fell to Cyrus of Persia The message to Judah was
Well,
clear.
just, what is your...
The fall of Babylon.
Yeah, the
proclaimed.
fall of Babylon.
Okay.
But that's not, sorry, but that's not actually part of the Bible, though. That's just added by Zondervan or whoever printed your
Okay,
Bible.
all right. All
But,
right.
so Isaiah, what Isaiah actually says is about the wilderness of the sea. He doesn't name it this time. But it is about Babylon. So this is Babylon again in this list. There's a lot of similarities and contrasts between the two lists. It's Babylon again, but this time he gives it an enigmatic name. But if you read it carefully, you can figure out who it's to. That's why your Bible editor put that. It is about Babylon.
The wilderness of the sea refers to Babylon.
It does, yes. And then he does that for all four of these, the first four. You can tell who it is, but he gives it an enigmatic name because, well, we'll talk about why in a moment. But look how Isaiah feels about these prophecies. It's not the same tone at all. Look at verse 3 of 21. Can anyone read 21:3?
For this reason, my loins are full of anguish. Pains have seized me like the pains of a woman in labor. I am so bewildered, I cannot hear. So terrified, I cannot see.
So Isaiah himself is aghast at these visions he's having of the future and what's going to happen. Verse 4, my heart staggers. Horror has appalled me. So he's not super pumped about it. But part of the reason why he's giving, in the second list, he's giving these enigmatic titles is because it's not just those people in Babylon who are going to be judged, although they are, but there is a principle of a certain thing about those people. In Babylon's case, the arrogance, right? But all kingdoms who are arrogant like that are going to fall in the same way. Okay, so who's next on this list? After Babylon.
Edom,
What's that?
Edom,
Edom. Somebody else said something.
Edom and Arabia.
Arabia.
Where does it say Edom? Okay, you're trying to think, Edom.
What verse is this?
it comes right under the end of 10.
Okay.
So verse.
The
This one
burden-
just zoom off.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yes.
The enigmatic names, are you going to talk about them later?
No.
Okay, so was the wilderness of the sea the name for Babylon?
Yes.
And then Duma would be the other name for Edom?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, we really don't. And if you look at 22, the Valley of Vision, what's that? Well, your heading might tell you. Chapter 22, it just says the Valley of Vision, but the Valley of Vision is what? Jerusalem. But again, an enigmatic name. Now, the first four have the enigmatic names, and the last one gets a plain name. Anyone see the last one? In chapter 23. Tyre. Yeah, Tyre is a little coastal city right here. And I always thought it was strange that it was such a big deal. It's like it's just one city. But again, that was when I was still thinking national borders like we have today. Tyre was essentially an empire. It was the most, they were the best shipbuilders and sailors and merchants in the world, and they were founding colonies all over the Mediterranean. One of their colonies was a city called Carthage. Anybody remember anything about Carthage from their Roman history, sort of a big deal, right? They were Rome's, and Carthage was founding colonies. They were Rome's biggest enemies throughout the whole growth of the Roman Empire. They were fighting Carthage up in Spain and in Italy and everywhere. That was one. Tarshish even, the place Jonah was trying to go to, a colony from Tyre. So they were a big deal. Okay, now if we had lots of time, you could break up into groups and you could compare these two sections and see similarities and then compare these two and compare these two. We don't have time to do any of that, unfortunately. But
Jacob, hang on just one second. I need to catch up here. This list was the order that he was going to be taking care of them or destroying them or they were going to fall, right?
well, it's a list of 10,
Okay.
but there
If
is
you had to give this list a title, what would it be?
this whole list. I could have numbered these, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Goes on, okay.
There is very little repetition other than Babylon. That's the only repeated one. But this list of 10 countries is just nations, peoples that God is going to judge.
Right, I got that. I
And-
just wasn't sure how, when it was one and one, if they were related, rather than going on. I'm so confused about.
It's a list of 10 nations,
Gotcha.
but I listed it like this to show that the structure of the list has some important features that are helpful to understanding why he's spending 11 chapters talking about the judgment of other countries. Yeah, so here's just 10,
That clarifies that, thank you.
10 groups that God is going to judge. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Stephen, did Isaiah have any time frame under which these judgments were going to occur, or he wasn't at all specific about it?
Yeah, he wasn't specific. The point that he was making, one of them is that all these kingdoms are doing their own thing, trying to conquer, trying to do their own thing, but God has his own purposes. God uses Babylon, well, he uses Assyria to punish Israel. Then he uses Babylon to punish Assyria. Then he uses the Medes to punish Babylon. They're like his instruments, and so God has his own purposes. So the big point here is that God has his own purposes in history. Or I guess in Isaiah's day he would not say history, he would say world events, because it's not history for him.
Jacob,
Yes.
you have it as 5 and 5, and you've suggested it doesn't have to be that. But given that it is, and if we had been in groups and had been making comparisons, are you saying there are in fact comparisons between each of those combinations?
Yeah, there are. And I'm going to highlight
Intended comparisons, or
Yeah.
just comparisons we can make?
intended comparisons. And I'm going to bring out one that I think will be the most helpful for us. Now, Babylon is over here, but there is a huge desert, the largest sand desert in the world here. And so you remember Abraham, when he travels to Canaan, travels this way. Everybody travels this way, right? It'd be like if somebody said, you went over to, I don't know, Eustis? Why'd you go around Lake Griffin? Why don't you just rent a pontoon and put your car on it and sail across? Well, yeah, I could have done that, but this is a way better way to go, just to drive around it. So they were always go around it. So the point then is, when Israel thought of Babylon coming, they never worried about Babylon sneaking through the desert. Babylon would always come this way. Okay? So Babylon would always come from the north. Philistia. Where is Philistia? Anybody know where Philistia is? It's over here, along the coast. Philistines were along the coast, to the west of God's people. What about Moab? Anybody know where Moab is? The other side over here, to the east. What about Egypt? Which direction? From the south, yes. And they were over here. They would come up this way. So Egypt from the south. So in both lists, you've got the people of God in slot 4. And in this list, in all directions from them. Let's look at this again. The second list in green. We've got Babylon again from the north. We've got Arabia. There were people living out here. But unless you were Arabian, you didn't travel through there. You've got Edom. Anybody know where Edom is? Sorry, I skipped Edom accidentally. Yeah, Edom is right down here. And anybody know where Tyre is? Tyre's over here in the east. So, in both lists, you've got the people of God in the list, in the midst of people groups that come from all points of the compass. So that's the point. You've got north, south, east, west, and you've got the people of God right in there in the list with them. So what is the point that Isaiah is trying to make? Let me use a different color here. There's Judah and Israel and Jerusalem. The point is that Israel, or the Jews, the people of God, are central. And if you're just speaking naturally, that makes them vulnerable. So who are they going to trust? Now they're always tempted to trust Assyria. That's who they should trust, Dean. But they should trust God. But it was always tempting to trust, I want to trust Assyria. Oh, Assyria is coming? Well, Egypt will back me up. Egypt was always trying to get these little kingdoms in here to fight with Babylon. They were always trying to do that for their own reasons. And sometimes they would come up and actually keep their word and help them fight. And sometimes they just didn't show up. But anyway, so who are they going to trust? So naturally speaking, the fact that they're central is scary for them. It means that they're in danger. But supernaturally speaking, from God's point of view, the point Isaiah is making is that they are central to God's purposes. All of these nations are just God's instruments. He has his own purposes for who's rising, who's falling, which son comes to power. It wasn't always the firstborn son. There's often political things as to which wife had which kid and and God was in control of all that. So they're central in the midst of danger, and they're also central in the midst of God's purposes. And God's moving in history with his own plans. They're central in God's plans. Look at 14:1. Now, raise your hand if you have NIV. Anybody have an NIV? No, okay. The NIV omits the first word of chapter 14, which is for. It's often an overlooked word, right? For God so loved the world. You just kind of forget about that word. But it's crucial here because he just got done in chapter 13 saying God's going to judge Babylon. And it's going to be all deserted. And there's just going to be jackals and owls inhabiting them. Okay? Chapter 14 says, because, here's why. The Lord will have compassion on Jacob.
It should make you feel good.
Yeah. But Jacob is another name for Israel. And he will again choose Israel. The reason he's judging these other nations is because of his plan for his people, Israel.
He'll set them in their own
He'll set them in their own land. God's plans have Israel at the center.
For what purpose?
Well, for his own purposes. Now,
Which was what?
well, all the things he's working on, working through them towards the coming of the Messiah.
That's the Isaiah perspective.
Yeah, I'm not saying right now all of God's plans have Israel at the center. I'm not saying yes or no to that. I'm saying that in Isaiah's day, he's saying we are God's people, and he's got us at the center of his plans. He's still doing something through us, even though our kingdom is collapsing, even though judgment is right around the corner. He's still doing something through the promises he made to Abraham, the promises he made to David, eternal dynasty. All those promises are still going to come true.
And Abraham.
And Abraham, yes.
And they're still not doing it.
They're still not doing those. So, but in Isaiah's day, what the point he's making here is, physically speaking, it's scary with all these nations around us. But we're in the middle of it all. But thinking about God, we're in the middle of his plans. We're in the center of that.
Isn't that what today? That's what we do.
You're referring to God's people as Christians or referring to Israel, the nation?
Just the time today and what's happening in our hope and our future. You know, our promises that God promises.
Oh, yeah. It's always that way. The eyes of
our country's kind of
sight,
scary right now. And
the eyes of sight and the eyes of faith. Yeah, there are scary things in the world, although, to be honest, way less scary than what was going on in Isaiah's day. I mean, we may face death, but probably not impalement. Anyway, I'm not trying to...
no, it just brought it to mind.
Yeah.
As these people are, being fearful, if you're not a Christian, you should be fearful now.
Yes. So, God's message to the Jews is trust me, not yourselves. If a group had compared these two, you'd see Jerusalem was relying on themselves and their city walls and what they have got stored up and their little tunnel that takes the water, so they have a water supply. Jerusalem was trusting in themselves, and God's saying, don't trust in yourself, trust in me. And Israel was trusting in their neighbors, teaming up with somebody else. And he's saying, don't trust yourselves and don't trust your neighbors. Trust me. And God's message to the other nations was the same thing. Don't trust in yourselves. Don't trust in your own gods. Trust in me. And what you've got is the last two on the list, both end up turning to God in the end. We'll just look up one last verse before we close, 19:19. It's easy to remember. Egypt was a very pagan society with lots of gods. And look at 19. Barbara, could you read 19:19?
In that day shall there be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord.
In the middle of Egypt, there's going to be an altar to the Lord. So, you've got two of these nations that Isaiah says someday they're going to turn to the Lord. So, in a sense, God's plan for the Jews is exactly the same as his plan for all the Gentile neighbors they have. Just turn to me and trust me. That's it. Don't trust in yourselves. Don't trust in what you can see. Just trust in me and my promises.
All the way back to Genesis 12. It hasn't changed.
Hasn't changed. Still the same today. It's just much more explicit today. Now that we know about Jesus and all that he...
The church acting much different than Israel is the church.
Oh,
That is
well,
different than Israel.
yeah, there's, yes, point well taken. And then you have to talk about, well, what is the church? Is it everybody who says, I'm a Christian? Or, so it gets complicated. But yeah, you're right. There's,
That's all the lukewarmness and things like that. The churches are changing.
yes, churches are either dying or changing. Yes. Okay, well, we're over time, so let's pray. God, thank you that you are faithful and that your promises don't change and that you do not go back on your promises. Forgive us for living and focusing on what we can see with our eyes and not what we know through your word. Teach us to trust you more and to rely on you wholly and only you. It's in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, that we pray. Amen.